History as it happens, March 1st, 2022. The road to war in Eastern Europe.
Ukraine has been victim of unprovoked aggression by Russian Federation.
Russian forces are closing in on Kyiv with skirmishes dotting the outskirts of the Ukrainian
Defending freedom will have costs.
What Putin did yesterday was tear up an agreement made 25 years ago. That's exactly what Hitler did.
By invading Ukraine, Russia is testing the limits of the world order established after 1945. A world order President George H.W. Bush hoped to maintain with NATO as its linchpin as the Cold War came to a close. Peace lasted for the better part of 3 decades in Europe, a period during which the West expanded to the East, but not all the way to Moscow, where democracy and prosperity were stillborn in the 1990s. What paved the road to this war? That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
That confrontation is now over. The nuclear threat, while far from gone, is receding. Eastern Europe is free. The Soviet Union itself is no more. This is a victory for democracy and freedom. It's a victory for the moral force of our values.
Vladimir Putin calls the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest tragedy of the 20th century, not because he misses communism as an economic system. He and other Russian nationalists are still wounded over the loss of the Soviet Empire and superpower status, where Eastern Europe was the USSR's sphere of influence. Ukraine holds a special place in all this as a former Soviet republic, a nation whose sovereignty Putin rejects as a matter of history and geopolitics. And that is why when I heard the news of the Russian invasion, I thought of what Ambassador Bill Taylor said on this podcast a couple weeks ago about what Putin wants.
I think he wants Ukraine. I think he wants more than Donbass. I think he wants more than, Crimea. I think he wants more than a swath of territory from Donbass to Odessa. I think he wants Ukraine.
Well, it remains to be seen if Putin will have Ukraine. By the time you listen to this episode, the war may have ended, or it could be dragging on as wars usually do. We're not going to try to predict the future here. Our concern is the past, and the past is at stake in this war, because what was seen as a triumph in the West, as an opportunity to enlarge NATO to guarantee the security of Europe in the 90s and beyond, as President Bush envisioned at the time.
Today, Europe is enjoying a period of unparalleled prosperity and an uninterrupted peace, longer than it is known in the modern age. And NATO has made the difference. And the alliance will prove every bit as important to American and European security in the decade ahead.
All of that was viewed from Moscow as a great humiliation that Putin is now trying to reverse, however foolish was his decision to start a war. In 1998, President Bill Clinton heralded the expansion of NATO to include countries once in the Soviet orbit.
Welcoming Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic into our alliance. If you look around at who's in the room today, you can see that they are more than willing to be a good partner.
And as our guest today wrote in his 2017 book, When the World Seemed New, 7 more Eastern European states joined NATO in 2004, and 2 more countries, once part of Moscow's broad sphere of influence, joined in 2009. Of those 12 new members, 7 had been part of the Warsaw Pact, and 3 were part of the Soviet Union itself.
I don't have a lot of respect for the argument that the United States and its allies pushed Russia to act aggressively in the post-Cold War period. People have to be responsible for their own actions.
Historian Jeffrey Engel is back with us. Our conversation is coming up in a moment. We'll discuss the NATO question and much more. Around the same time Clinton was touting NATO's enlargement, former Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev, in a visit to Congress, warned U.S. lawmakers that it was dangerous.
Нельзя унижать народ, нацию, и нельзя рассчитывать, что это так пройдет все.
You may not humiliate a nation, a people, and think that it'll have no consequences.
Ну и другое, это что уже, новая стратегия?
So my question is this a new strategy?
Well, as we know, Ukraine is not part of NATO. It was vaguely offered or promised future membership in 2008, but by invading Ukraine, Russia is trying to prevent that from ever happening. In the sweep of history, 30 years is not a lot of time. It only feels that way when I meet young people who have no living memory of the USSR. So what we're witnessing in Eastern Europe today may simply be a consequence of the collapse of an empire, the Soviet Empire. Not inevitable, of course, but merely delayed, as a revanchist Russia hopes to restore its sphere of influence against what it views as a hostile West. An outcome George Bush, as he declared victory in the Cold War, hoped Europe, including Russia, would avoid by embracing Western values and institutions. Jeffrey Engel is founding director of the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University, and he is the author of a must-read book, given what's happening in Europe right now. When the World Seemed New, George H.W. Bush and the End of the Cold War. Jeffrey Engel, welcome back, my friend.
Always good to talk to you.
Well, I've reached for your book, When the World Seemed New, many times when preparing for podcasts over the past year. And I did so again when I started to think about how to frame a discussion about how we got to this place right now. You know, when the USSR invaded Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968, there was no question of Western intervention. Today, however, there is no Warsaw Pact, there is no USSR, and Ukraine has been an independent sovereign nation since 1991. But now Russia's invasion is raising old questions left unresolved in the post-Cold War order. So why don't we begin with one of those questions or issues, and that is the New World Order President Bush hoped to leave his successors, one where war in Europe would have been unthinkable because of NATO's lasting presence. What are your thoughts along those lines as far as what Bush wanted by maintaining NATO in Europe?
You know, I would actually kind of reframe the question a little bit. It's not that the Bush administration and people at the end of the Cold War within the United States policymaking circles thought that war was unthinkable. They thought about it all the time. They just thought that the best way to prevent war in Europe was for the United States to be present, for the United States to be an active member in European security. And of course, the best way to ensure that you have an invitation into the conversation of European security was to remain in NATO and for NATO to remain strong. And I think this is really critical to how American policymakers of this era, and frankly, I would argue of every era up until the end of the Cold War, thought about European security, which was premised upon one fundamental problem, which is that Europe is full of Europeans, and Europeans have a tendency to go to war with each other every 20 to 30 years. And in World War I, we were drawn in, won the war from our perspective. World War II, we had to go do it again. And the entire purpose of American post-Cold War strategy was to ensure that we didn't have to go do it a third time. So from the American perspective, the only way to solve the problem of European security is to make it an American problem and for us to essentially keep our hands on the shoulders, if you will, of our European allies.
NATO is based on the many bonds between us. Our shared heritage, history, and culture, our shared commitment to freedom, democracy, and the rights of individuals.
At the end of the Cold War, when the fate of that order was questioned, Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia, because the Warsaw Pact was gone, he wanted NATO to be gone as well. Did other European leaders want NATO out, or was he one of the only ones? We know that George Bush rejected that idea, and we're going to get to Bush in a moment. Did any other European states say, we don't need any military alliances?
Well, this was actually the great threat that Germany offered both the West and the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War during negotiations over what would happen once the Berlin Wall fell and once it became clear after a plebiscite in Eastern Europe that the East was going to join the West and that the West was going to dominate. I'm talking about in Germany. There was a question of what to do with Germany's security. Should it remain in NATO? Or another idea that was offered, in particular by some high-ranking German officials, including their foreign minister, was perhaps we should become a neutral state. And there's a couple of advantages to being a neutral state. The first is many people in Europe, remember this is only 40 years after World War II, many people in Europe remembered what Germans had done during World War II and were not too keen to have Germans as a military state in the first place. And secondly, the German people themselves were not keen to have spent the last 2 generations in between potentially warring superpowers with their country as a nuclear battlefield if conflict ever arose. So there was a lot of momentum within German policymaking circles that perhaps the way to solve the problem, to get Europe to accept our unification, was to say, in exchange for us being a unified country, we promise to neutralize ourselves, perhaps even demilitarize ourselves, and essentially forsake any military presence and any security presence in the future. Now, I have to say, Helmut Kohl, the leader of Germany at the time, was never particularly interested in this. And the United States and its leadership under President Bush was never interested in this, for the very fundamental reason that Germany really matters. Germany is important. If you want to have a security structure in Europe, having the most populous and also prosperous state on your side is something that policymakers really wanted. But to your question, people like Václav Havel, first Democratic president of Czechoslovakia, they actually changed their minds over these things as time goes on. Havel, who of course we should remember was a playwright and a poet, was very interested in the beautiful idea of the panacea of peace. Why can't we all become neutral? And that was actually his first discussions with American policymakers after he became president, was to say, we'd like to be neutral. Over time, Havel recognized that that was a nice fantasy, but was not practical. And if you're going to have to choose sides, because life forces you to choose sides, better to side with the forces of democracy, better to side with the forces of the free market and capitalism and prosperity, and frankly, better to side with the country that hasn't invaded you recently, the United States, as opposed to the Soviet Union.
When we look back on the concerns about a revanchist Germany after the end of the Cold War and its reunification, it might seem absurd to people listening to this today, but at the time it wasn't, because of what had happened in the first half of the 20th century. But as you said, everyone realized a strong, united Germany had to be at the center of the new Europe. But there was a question of whether NATO troops would be in what had been East Germany. And that gets us to one of the real thorns in Putin's side as far as he's concerned. Promises that were or were not made at that time. So why don't we go there now? What was promised? What was agreed to? Was anything actually signed about NATO's eastward expansion? Because depending on who you ask, nothing was agreed to or everything was agreed to. And that also raises the question of how binding were those agreements 30 years ago?
This is a great question, and it's really at the heart of the historical argument between Vladimir Putin and the West. And it all stems back actually to some conversations that occurred largely in February and March and April of 1990. In particular, in February of 1990, now just to give everybody a sense of the timeline here, the Berlin Wall falls in November of 1989. So we're only talking 12 weeks or so after the wall has fallen, this thing that most policymakers thought they would never see in their entire lifetime. And the train was rolling towards some form of German unification. So the question was, what form would that take? As I mentioned before, would it be neutral? Would it be a NATO country? Would it be something else? And the Soviets and the French and the British and the Americans, by virtue of the way World War II ended, essentially all had legal responsibility for Germany's fate. So the American Secretary of State, James Baker, went to Moscow. And by the way, this is one of literally 1,000 conversations between Western policymakers and Soviet policymakers.
That's right. And let's remind folks listening that the Soviet Union is still intact at this point. It takes another couple of years for it to go away.
Yeah, they're not going to go away officially until December of 91. So, the Soviet Union is cracking. Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, is desperately in need of financial assistance and also desperately in need of the West ramping down its security threats so that he can continue to take the money that would have been spent on military and spend it towards his greater domestic needs. That's actually the whole point, to my mind, of perestroika and glasnost, the changes that Gorbachev initiates in 1985, which essentially start this entire process of the end of the Cold War. And James Baker, American Secretary of State, close friend of George H.W. Bush, one might argue his closest friend, goes to Moscow and begins talking to Gorbachev about what the future of Germany might be. And he floats an idea. He says, well, what if we decide that NATO jurisdiction won't advance 1 inch to the east? And Gorbachev says, oh, that sounds pretty good. That sounds nice. But then later in the conversation, and this part, by the way, is forgotten by everyone except for the historians, later in the conversation, Gorbachev says, I'm thinking about this. What if we went in the other direction? What if everybody became part of NATO? In fact, what if we joined NATO, the Soviet Union? And Baker said, that's interesting. We should talk about that. And that's basically where the conversation ended for that conversation, with the Soviets believing that the American Secretary of State had floated the idea that perhaps NATO would not expand eastward, and the American Secretary of State believing that we had ongoing discussions to have. Now, here's where it gets fun, and here's where it gets complicated. On the way home, Secretary Baker realized and was told by the National Security Council when he reported that he had made a real bonehead mistake in making this suggestion. I wouldn't say it's a promise. I'd say a suggestion. And that is that, and this is get technical, if NATO expansion, if NATO sovereignty, if NATO protection doesn't expand 1 inch to the east, well, technically, from the moment that he said that, that would include not covering Eastern Germany. We're not talking all of unified Germany. We're talking at that point about the 100-mile wide, Long Island wide area of Eastern Germany. And that just doesn't kind of make any sense. I mean, you can't have a country that's both in and out of a security alliance.
And there were still Soviet troops in East Germany at that point as well.
Yeah. Part of the discussion was, would German troops, once unified, move into Eastern Germany? Well, first thing that has to happen is that the Soviet troops need to get out. And by the way, parenthetically, the Soviets don't have enough money to actually pay for their own troops to get home at this point. That's how desperate they are for finances. So in essence, once Secretary Baker comes home to Washington, he realizes that what he has suggested, again, not a promise, a suggestion, isn't practical in any way, shape, or form. And the conversation moves on. And ultimately, the conversation winds up for the signing of German unification among all the great powers, that Germany itself, all of Germany, including the East, would fall under NATO jurisdiction. And that's what Gorbachev and other Soviet leaders agreed to. In essence, what we have here, and this is, I'm going to take a big picture back, what we have here is a moment where there is a discussion of a potential future. And the American perspective and the Western perspective largely is Secretary of State Baker made a suggestion, which was never signed, never documented, never written down, never part of a treaty. And by the way, the Americans moved on from that suggestion within days.
Bush told Baker, bad idea, right?
Bad idea. This is one of those moments Baker not infrequently threatened to resign. Quietly, mostly because I think he knew that Bush was his best friend and former tennis doubles partner, so he could blow off some steam at the president whenever he needed to. The critical thing is from the Russian perspective. It has become an article of faith, of religious faith almost, that this was a moment where the West promised that NATO would not expand east. Gorbachev accepted that promise, and then boom, here we are 30 years later, and NATO has expanded east. So what's beautiful, by which I mean horrible, about this historical argument is that both sides have just enough evidence to make their argument. The American argument and the Western argument being it was never a real promise. It was a discussion. By the way, part of that discussion included maybe the Soviets would join NATO. And Russians, Vladimir Putin in particular, saying, hey, look, we got a promise at the end of the Cold War that you would not expand, and you did. And if you read the historical record, there's frankly enough evidence for each side to make a plausible case in the public arena.
Putin used the words "not 1 inch." He cited the so-called promise in his most recent news conference at the end of last year. In December, he holds his annual news conference, and he referenced the "not 1 inch" supposed promise. But of course, events overtook some of these earlier discussions. The Soviet Union collapsed. The Baltic states, which had been SSRs, joined NATO. They wanted to join NATO when they were no longer under Moscow's yoke. Back to Bush, he told Baker, bad idea, because in his mind, and this goes back to my very first question to you, in his mind, NATO's lasting presence was the aim of his foreign policy during his presidency, which at this point he does not know is only going to be one term.
Yes. And by the way, I'm going to preempt a question that you might have, which is what would have happened to NATO expansion if Bush had a second term? And I'm going to say, I don't know. I genuinely don't know, because it was such an open question for the administration at the end of their one term. But more profoundly and more importantly, Bush was consistent, and he said this publicly, and he said this privately, and he wrote this in his diary. So when you put those three together, I tend to believe someone when all those are consistent. He was astoundingly worried about the fact that the end of the Cold War, largely a good thing, also meant that we don't know what's going to happen next.
Because when empires break up, lots of stuff can happen. The
Wars.
Soviet Empire.
Wars typically happen. I mean, historically, nature abhors a vacuum. When an empire collapses, there's usually a great power conflict. And Bush had no idea what was going to come next. And he read the history of the 20th century, which, by the way, was also the history of his own life, to suggest that Europeans went to war, Americans got dragged in. Since we were in Europe after 1949, arguably after 45, but after 49, when NATO begins, guess what? There has not been a hot war in Europe. And you can say, is that causation? Is that correlation? Bush said, I don't care, because I don't know what the future is going to bring, and neither do you. So what my major enemy is uncertainty. And the one thing that I know is that whatever happens in the future, if the United States has a presence in Europe, and by the way, is the strongest military power in Europe through NATO, we will have a say in what happens, and we will not be dragged in. And Bush's primary responsibility then, primary goal, was to make sure that future presidents had a seat at the table, if you will, in European affairs, lest we be pulled in from the outside.
These were also very heady days as well, we have to remember. The United States in 91 wins a quick and easy war in the Persian Gulf. The USSR is laid low. Democracy is on the march. And essentially the attitude among U.S. policymakers was, well, we can ignore Russia. Of course, Russia remembers that attitude. Putin remembers that attitude. But that also played a role here, right? And, my initial question talking about how to make war an unthinkable possibility, in Bush's view, of course, he knew that wars were always possible, but you minimize the chances if all of Europe, not just Western Europe, belong to the same alliance. And who cares if Russia doesn't like it?
Bush was, and I think this is actually a critique that one could lodge against Bush, Bush was not a dreamer. Bush was a pragmatist and a realist. He was under no illusion that the New World Order, as he described it, ironically in a speech given on September 11th of 1990, that the New World Order would be better. It would be freer. It would be more just. It would be more peaceful. The key word in all of that is more. He didn't think that we had solved the human condition. He thought that people were still going to fight with each other and people were still going to have jealousies. So what do we need to do to make sure that American security and by extension, European security is ensured? Well, let's at least make sure that we are there on site as the biggest military presence to make sure that once conflict arises again, as it inevitably will, we will have the opportunity to intervene. And I just want to play a thought experiment here for a second, that imagine that everything about the last 30 years plays out exactly the same, except the United States is no longer in NATO. And
there might not be a NATO.
First of all, there probably wouldn't be a NATO. But secondly, let's say, okay, so the Soviets leave Eastern Europe at the end of the Cold War. And then someone like Vladimir Putin comes in, who, by the way, for all kinds of domestic reasons, if nothing else, has a lot of good rationale for trying to paint the West as an enemy. And if he wants to continue to expand his influence, as, by the way, Russian leaders have done for centuries, if he wants to expand his influence and the United States did not have a security guarantee with NATO, we wouldn't be talking about what's going on in Ukraine. We'd be talking about what's going on in the Czech Republic or in Slovakia or in Poland or in Hungary, because the only reason I would argue that those countries are at the moment, as we discussed this in February of 2022, the only reason those countries are safe, quote unquote, is because they are within the American security umbrella. If the American security umbrella didn't exist, who is going to push back on Russian extremism? Well, historically, that's been the Germans. And frankly, that hasn't worked out so well for Europe.
That's another issue we can get to a little bit later, because that's really at the heart of the debate happening right now about whether NATO's eastern push is a legitimate Russian national security concern or is simply being used as a pretext to fulfill, as you put it, Russia's historic expansionist tendencies. And we often forget that Stalin invaded just as many countries, or nearly as many countries, as Hitler did between 1939 and 1941 during the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Not to digress, I did reference briefly the war in Iraq in 1991, referencing New World Order, and that's not just some conspiratorial term. The assumption among Bush and his administration was, if the United States doesn't do it, who will, right? In a sense, those concerns played out in the early 1990s when Yugoslavia imploded. Well, Europe didn't get involved in that, either did the United States. And actually, Baker himself said, we can't get involved in this civil war.
Yeah, he said we have no dog in this fight. In fact, he went out a step further and said we don't want a dog in this fight. Civil wars are unpleasant. They're particularly unpleasant when they're combined with ethnic hatred and ethnic cleansing. And it took from the beginning of the conflict or tensions in Yugoslavia at the end of the Cold War until the end of the Clinton administration, not till the end of Clinton's second term, for Americans to finally, if you will, get up the gumption to lead Europe to put its money where its moral mouth had been for the last two generations. That if one of the mantras of Europe after the Second World War was never again will we allow a Holocaust, never again will we allow that level of ethnic cleansing. Well, frankly, the Europeans didn't have enough enthusiasm to match their words in Yugoslavia once ethnic cleansing began again after the end of the Cold War. And it wasn't until the United States was willing to take the lead, and by the way, this is not unimportant, willing to use its military technological superiority, that there was a military solution attempted in Yugoslavia. So it's really a great example of how American policymakers have consistently argued that Europeans won't lead without us. And here's the thing, the Europeans typically don't lead without the United States. Now this is a chicken and egg argument, because the United States has predominant military power, which, by the way, most European nations like, because it means they get security without having to pay for it.
That's right.
It also means that Americans get frustrated because they look at the European allies and say, why can't you do more? To which the response is, we don't have the military because you got the military.
I had Andrew Bacevich on this podcast recently, and he has been calling for the United States to leave NATO for quite a while, saying that Europe, a mature continent of nation states, should be able to handle its own security. And if European nations decide they don't want to get involved in a war between, say, Russia and Ukraine, then that's their decision to make.
Can I jump in on that
for
a second? There is no more important and profound thinker of international affairs in my mind today than Andrew Bacevich. And I have my students read multiple of his books over the course of their graduate education. So here I'm going to most respectfully say I have a different take on this. I think it is entirely reasonable, as he said, that Europe has the resources, Western Europe in particular, to handle its own defense, to which I would argue history doesn't suggest they do a good job. I would argue that the last thing that we need for American security is for the Germans and the French and the Italians and the British to all feel that they need to protect themselves against each other, or at least protect themselves against someone else in Europe. And my critique, which I think I share with Professor Bacevich, is with the adventurism of the United States in the third world and in the developing world, in the Middle East, wars of choice. I am less bothered by the steady investment of security as insurance that we pay to NATO and that we pay in Europe, I think, than Professor Bacevich.
But then history can become a burden, right? And this takes us back to that issue of, is NATO's expansion to the east the cause of what we're seeing now? Because on the one hand, you have Bush's thinking in the early 1990s that Europe needs NATO. But on the other hand, Putin and the Russian establishment, actually going back to Yeltsin, even Gorbachev, sees NATO enlargement as potentially threatening, it's hostile, and would spark a war rather than prevent one.
Yeah, I have to say I don't have a lot of respect for the argument that the United States and its allies pushed Russia to act aggressively in the post-Cold War period. People have to be responsible for their own actions. And let's remember that Russia was a democracy very, very briefly in the 1990s, and certainly has not been under Vladimir Putin. And that's a generation already. And that state has become more and more and more closed and totalitarian, and I would argue against the international order. In essence, the Russian argument, or the pro-Russian argument, is, well, look, the United States didn't do enough to make us act right. At the end of the Cold War, people were embracing democracy throughout Eastern Europe. People were embracing a different view of security throughout Eastern Europe. And frankly, most of Eastern Europe wanted to go in the American direction because of their own historical experiences.
Yeah, the Baltic states were one.
Yeah, wanted to join NATO. Who hasn't been invaded by the Soviets? It was basically the question, or the Russians at the very least. There is no reason that the idea Mikhail Gorbachev was fascinated by and driven by, that if we break down Cold War barriers, remove the Iron Curtain, that we could finally, we Russians, finally become a full part of Europe. I don't see any particular reason why the Russians couldn't have continued to strive for that, except that Vladimir Putin, beginning in his first years of office at the beginning of the 21st century, found it more politically profitable to view Western encroachments as an advance as opposed to an open invitation.
Though throughout history, it's not uncommon to find situations like this where one side believes it's acting defensively and the other side sees those defensive moves as offensive, and vice versa. I don't know if we can entirely dismiss Russian security concerns as irrational or as a pretext or an excuse to act aggressively, because all Russian leaders have issued warnings about encroachment by NATO.
You're right, but there's a paranoid streak that's ingrained in your premise. Putin is very successful at arguing, or at least he repeatedly argues, that the West is out to get us, and the West has always been out to get us.
That goes back to Lenin, right, and Stalin.
Well, it goes back to Peter the Great.
Encirclement.
Frankly, I don't see the world that way. If there's one thing that we know about the West at the end of the Cold War, it was largely financially driven by market opportunities in terms of its expansion. American policymakers, like the rest of Western Europeans, thought in essence that peace would follow the dollar, or the Deutschmark, or ultimately the euro, and that the countries which created a stable legal system and a stable investment environment would become more integrated with the West. Places like Poland and places like Hungary in fits and starts did that, and security followed. For the Soviets and for the Russians thereafter, they had the opportunity to take really, really difficult steps in a very difficult environment. I don't want to suggest it was ever going to be easy. Their economic and political environment at the end of the 1990s was devastating and difficult, to say the least. But
their experiment with capitalism went terribly.
Well, but it was a short-lived experiment.
It was an overnight conversion, and essentially the nation was robbed by its kleptocrats.
So listen, I always like to find a simple analogy, which oversimplifies things. That's the way I think about life. But my analogy for this is the sickness of the Soviet economy and the Soviet disease was going to need to be purged at the end of the Cold War, that the Soviets and the Russian people thereafter were going to have to take their medicine, take antibiotics. One of the things that happens with antibiotics sometimes is you get an awful stomach ache. And that doesn't mean you're supposed to, the doctors tell us, you're not supposed to stop the course of antibiotics till you're done. I think in the 1990s, and this is easy for me to say because I'm an American and I didn't have to suffer through this, but in the 1990s, the Soviets and the Russians began their course of medicine, found it unpleasant, and decide they're going to go in a different direction. So the very fact that all of Russia by the end of the 1990s, I would argue, became a kleptocracy, that is, in my opinion, self-inflicted.
This also raises another question, not fully resolved after the end of the Cold War. Is Russia part of the West? Is it part of Europe? Or is it outside of that circle? You address this in the conclusion of your book, When the World Seemed New. You argue that the West did try to integrate Russia, or I should say the United States and Western Europe tried to integrate Russia in a number of ways. World Trade Organization, 1994, Russia joined NATO's Partnership for Peace, also a Russia-NATO Council. Russia often feels it's not really a member of these organizations. What is your take on this today as this war rages on, of whether this issue has ever been fully resolved to anyone's satisfaction?
No, the issue has not been resolved. And this is the animus for Mikhail Gorbachev's transformations at the end of the Cold War, I would argue, was the idea that we're going to resolve this issue once and for all. We're going to build, as he called it, a bridge to a common European home, the word being common, that is, say that we would be part of Europe too. And he essentially, and Yeltsin following him in his first couple of years, opened themselves up to the idea that we are going to join Europe. And it went badly from the beginning. You know, the economy collapsed. Russian society, they had their own security issues they wanted to deal with in places like Chechnya. And more importantly, Russia became increasingly an unreliable partner for the broader international system. And we see this in terms of the difficulties in the Russian legal system. And we see this in terms of the difficulties in the Russian investment environment, that Russia did not decide to take the difficult, painful steps that other Eastern European countries did, take their medicine and create a liberal international order. And the two things I'm going to say are not unrelated. Why is it that people form alliances? Well, they form alliances for two fundamental reasons, typically because they fear somebody together, but secondly, because they have mutually aligned systems. And increasingly, if I ask you, where would you seek justice? Where would you like to be somebody who is a protester? Where would you like to be somebody who wants to make a change in the world that changes the order of your government? Would you rather do that in Germany, France, the United States, or Russia? Everybody in their right mind would say the last place you'd want to do that is Russia, because it does not hold the same democratic values.
Back to New World Order and the Iraq War, First Gulf War. As you point out in your book, I believe you were one of the first historians to discover, if not the first historian to discover these documents. When Saddam invaded Kuwait, the initial reaction inside the Bush administration was, well, so what if a barrel of oil has an Iraqi flag rather than a Kuwaiti flag? In other words, that's not our fight. Eventually, they came around to thinking, well, if this tin pot dictator believes he can invade any country with impunity, then who's next? So George H.W. Bush put together an international coalition, and Saddam Hussein was expelled from Kuwait. But it's one thing to expel Saddam from a tiny country. It's another to go to war with Russia over Ukraine, right? Or it's another thing to get involved in the civil wars in Yugoslavia. And to my initial point about unresolved questions, how security should be maintained, not on paper, but in real life, in Europe, after the end of the Cold War, has always been really difficult, as evidenced by what happened in Yugoslavia and what is happening now in Ukraine. And there's also the issue, if the West was going to expand NATO towards Russia's borders, then we had to provide for the defense of those countries. That really didn't happen either. I mean, the Baltic states are in NATO, but they don't have many NATO forces. They're tiny countries.
You know, I'm going to disagree on that last point.
Go ahead.
I'm not going to disagree that they're tiny countries, and I'm not going to disagree that they don't have particularly impressive militaries, but I'm going to disagree that they don't have NATO security. One of the key solutions, I think, to this current crisis is to go back to where the Cold War began. George Kennan's American Soviet specialist, his strategy of containment, which originated in 1946 and became the basis, I would argue, for all of American foreign policy in the Cold War for the entire duration of the Cold War.
He opposed NATO expansion, though. Right?
He did. At the end of the Cold War, he did. And his idea in 1946 and in 47, 48 going on, it was always a little bit evolving. But his idea, in essence, was let's draw the lines where they are. And we can't change the reality of what's on the other side of the fence. So let's make sure the fence lines don't move. Let's make sure that the countries that are our allies, Kennan said, can withstand Soviet penetration and subversion. And in time, the countries on the other side of the fence line, those within the Soviet Empire, which we are not willing to fight for right now because it's not worth fighting and giving our lives for a cause that is too deadly, that they will in time come over to our side. I would argue that what NATO has effectively done is to move the fence line. I'll come back to that because obviously that's one thing that Putin is upset about, but move the fence line so that there is very little that we can actually do about Ukraine right now if we are not willing to put our own soldiers at risk. And I, for one, am not.
And of course,
Now,
Ukraine is not part of NATO, but go ahead.
That's my point. We have signed agreements with Poland, with Hungary, with Slovakia, with other countries to say that you are within our security agreement. Donald Trump may not like it, but the American people have put their signature on the line to say that if you are part of NATO, and I reference Donald Trump because he criticized NATO for this all the time, if you are part of NATO, then we will come to your defense. We have never said that for Ukraine to the same extent. So I suspect what's going to happen, what I hope in some ways is going to happen for the sake not of the Ukrainian people, but for the sake of the rest of Europe and the world, is that the line gets drawn, unfortunately, with much of Ukraine on the other side, on the Russian side, because I and most Americans and most Europeans are not willing to cause a major war to secure the eastern part of Ukraine. But we have said we are drawing the line at Poland and Slovakia and Hungary and other neighboring countries. And I think that's the new wave of containment we're going to see for generations to come.
I do not mean to imply that Russia would or could invade Poland or the Baltic states under a different set of circumstances.
Well, they could, sure.
Well, they could. Or that they would. I'm not saying that either.
Yeah.
That's a difficult one. So here we are in 2022. Something is happening that I never thought I would see again, a land war in Eastern Europe. And it often does get framed as a battle not between Russia and Ukraine, who share a unique history. As we know, Putin has his own views on Ukraine sovereignty. It's being framed as a battle between authoritarianism on one side and democracy and freedom on the other. I think that can be dangerous because it can drag outsiders into a local conflict.
Again, I'm going to reference Donald Trump. He said during the first days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine that Putin is a genius. I think Putin has sowed his own destruction in this regard.
Yeah, that's another issue, but I do want to just quickly interject here, Jeffrey. He made a miscalculation of epic proportions, but go ahead.
Putin or Trump?
Putin.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I think so, because, what has happened in the last, several days? Well, I think three things have happened that have been really critical. The Russian stock market has tanked. The Russian bond market and the currency exchange with the West has tanked. But most importantly, the Germans have decided to ratchet up their military spending dramatically, that they are going to spend, now they have announced, 100 billion euros over the next year buying new weaponry, including weaponry that they're going to ship some of it to Ukrainian forces. That's almost double what Russia spends every year on its military. And that's just one, granted a large one, but just one NATO state. So the Germans have pledged to go from 1.5% of their GDP spending on security to a little over 2% of their security on Germany. Now, that might not seem like a lot to the average ear, but let me remind you, that is significantly more than the size of Russian military spending. So what they have done by taking this part of Ukraine is essentially to animate their enemies to say, well, I guess we do have to actually put our money where our mouth is where it comes to security, which suggests to me that one of two things will happen. Either it won't go any further, the conflict and Russian aggression, or it will, and there's going to be a nuclear war and we're all going to be dead. So
well, that's
I'm going to hope for the former.
Those are two polar extremes.
Well, you didn't ask me what the odds were for each of them. I think, my nightmare scenario is not high on my list of probabilities.
Well, we are dealing with a nuclear power here, and Putin did put his nuclear forces on alert, or I'm not sure I'm using the right.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, he did put it on alert. And Russian military doctrine allows for the use of tactical nuclear weapons, not as a last resort. A tactical nuclear weapon that can take out a city, but not to get to that terrible scenario.
No, but I think that's actually really important. Two things about this. First, it's notable that American strategic forces did not respond in kind, at least to my knowledge, at least as of the conversation that we're having today. The real danger in a nuclear escalation is that each side continues to up its own security defenses, as you point out earlier, for perfectly legitimate defensive reasons, and ultimately gets to a point where the only step that's left is pushing the button. Well, if the United States and its allies are not going to join in that spiral, then the Russians are out on their own, which suggests, as you point out, The Russians could use nuclear weapons. They could use tactical nuclear weapons. And one would have to say you'd have to be crazy to do so. Nobody has tried that button since 1945, which raises the distinct possibility that Vladimir Putin is an irrational actor.
And it's hard to know if he's lost his bearings.
Think about what it is that he has done for the Russian people with these actions, not just over this last month, but over the last 8 years in particular, since the first invasion of Ukraine and the Crimea. The Russian economy has slowed dramatically, regardless of COVID, has slowed dramatically compared to the rest of the world. Global investment in Russia has slowed dramatically. Russian bonds are basically junk status at this point. So that's only going to get worse.
He might destabilize his regime with this war. So.
Yeah, and made life worse for his citizens.
So Jeffrey Engel, let's wrap up by returning to the initial premise, and that is the world order that George H.W. Bush hoped to bequeath to his successors and that Bill Clinton tried to maintain as well, something that still angers Vladimir Putin. This was a 1997 decision between Yeltsin and Clinton, the U.S. and the Russian Federation. Putin sees this agreement or deal as a mistake that he wants to undo. How is this relevant to what's going on now? What was agreed to in 97?
I'm reminded of that old aphorism by some American policymaker, and maybe it wasn't even an American, who knows? I mean, this is the best part of stories is forgetting who actually said it to get to the meaning, which is the only thing worse than a politician who can be bought is a politician that won't stay bought. And the Soviets and then the Russians were in terrible straits at the end of the Cold War. And they negotiated away their right to determine the fate of Germany for a lot of money. And they negotiated their right to determine the fate of NATO for a lot of money. And Putin essentially is making the argument that we sold it, but it was a bad deal.
And I want to undo it.
Or we sold it and I want more. So there's a part of me that feels like this is analogous to, I don't know, a student saying, I went to college, I paid the tuition. Yeah, I got straight D's and F's, but why didn't I get a six-figure job at the end of it? Well, I would argue because you got straight D's and F's. And the Russians, and again, this doesn't give me joy to say, but the Russian government and the Russian leadership did not continue down the path towards prosperity that Poland, Hungary, and other countries did at the end of the Cold War. And they can argue that they should have had more aid. And I would argue maybe, but that doesn't excuse you for ultimately choosing the wrong path just because you didn't get enough help.
U.S. aid you're referring to in this
Western
period.
aid.
Well, I mentioned before how history can become a burden. The fact is, it is. Mm-hmm. History weighs heavily on everything that's happening here. And decisions made, agreements made, words that were exchanged do not tie our hands today. But we do see the weight of history and what's going on here. Do you have any final thoughts?
I do, and I'm going to return to...
As an expert on the end of the Cold War, do you have any?
Well, I'm going to return to the end of the Cold War and say that Bush's great fear as the president at the end of the Cold War was that European states would continue their historic trend towards militarism and nationalism without an American hand upon their shoulder. What did I just describe a few minutes ago? The Germans have just said that they are going to increase their military spending dramatically. What part of 19th and 20th century history sounds good with the beginning of the sentence, then the Germans increased their military spending dramatically?
None.
Right. I am not happy with anything that's happened, but I am comforted that the United States has more of a say as the dominant military power in Europe than if it did not.
And maybe instead of seeing the collapse of an order, it'll be reaffirmed when, well, we don't know how this is going to end, so I don't want to say anything that would be premature.
We don't, but I both fear and expect that we are going to be talking a lot more about George Kennan again in the years to come.
Jeffrey Engel, author of When the World Seemed New, we thank you for your insights. And we all hope this new war ends quickly and does not leave a legacy of rancor and ethnic hatred as past European wars have. On that note, on the next episode of History as It Happens, we'll continue our discussion of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Vladimir Putin's desperate play by speaking to one of the world's finest military historians. Sir Anthony Beaver joins us next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.